Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show. Today bringing you a really cool guest involved in creating a better and safer tomorrow for all of us. And, it was for those that follow the show, following our episode with Uri Oran over at the Israeli Space Agency, who talked about this company, its technologies. He was like, you got to get them on the show. And, when I checked it out, I was like, definitely, this is going to be an awesome episode. But so anyway, following that, we have the honor today of being joined by Dr. Oren Milstein. He is the Chief Executive Officer, board member of a company called StemRad. They are a world leader in the provision of personal radiation protection solutions. They're the first company to offer life-saving protection from various forms of penetrating ionizing radiation to make the lives of first responders, military personnel, utility personnel, medical teams, and even astronauts safer without compromising their missions. The company is comprised of radiation biology experts, nuclear physicists, designers, engineers. They got a couple dozen prominent doctors, including 3 Nobel laureates advising them, really as they develop these cutting-edge tools to protect these various heroes, not just on Earth, but potentially beyond out in space. Dr. Milstein co-founded StemRad back in 2011, shortly after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, and has been leading R&D efforts ever since, and was appointed CEO in 2016. Dr. Milstein has over a decade of life science experience. Formerly was a European Molecular Biology Organization fellow at NYU in the area of biomolecular medicine. Their research was focused on providing insights to mechanisms of T-cell activation. Later on, he was an NIH fellow at Scripps Research Institute, discovering some interesting mechanisms for iron deficiency anemia. And then his research went on to look at all sorts of interesting areas like radiation-induced autoimmune diseases. He did his Ph.D. At the Weizmann Institute back in 2008, studying strategies for bone marrow transplantation in irradiated subjects. Did his undergrad work at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And we're honored to have him with us. Really cool topic, a lot to get into, and an awesome guest. Dr. Oren Milstein, thanks so much for taking time to come on the show.
Of course, Ira, it's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, it's great to be on your very established and lucrative show.
It's awesome having you. And as I said, when Uri talked about you, I really got excited and was really looking forward to doing this episode. Would love to start off as we typically do by handing things over to you for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about you. I enjoy, as people who watch the show know, sort of going into your research history. I talked a little bit about it in the bio. You have everything in here from human and pig kidney organogenesis research. You study the pathogenesis of certain amoebas. It took you up to 2008, and again, as mentioned, your dissertation, looking not just at allogeneic stem cell transplantation, but of course thinking about the situations that a lot of these patients find themselves in terms of radiation. Take us back to the early days, if you would, and sort of what got you thinking of a lot of these topics.
Yes, so it really depends on how early you're asking, because I think at the end of the day, it's less about your intellectual progress, more about your emotional mindset. rather than the intellectual mindset. How you feel about the world, where you think this world is going. And I think, really the foundation for me pursuing protective technologies it really goes all the way back, to the Holocaust and what our people underwent there, and just the need to protect anyone from anything is really something that's embedded, within my education and upbringing, I would say. I'm a dual American Israeli citizen, so I try to do my best for both of my nationalities. As far as the Israeli one goes, we've been under, the presumed nuclear threat from Iran's direction for many years. So even before my studies or my formal studies began, I'm talking about the 90s. I was already looking for ways, asking around, exploring ways to protect our people from the next Holocaust, if you will. And that's something that was a yearning, a craving for me almost to participate in, to be better prepared this time around compared to my grandparents that had to flee and so on and so forth, and they were lucky to survive because all their families perished. So I definitely, that was my mindset. And then we had the Gulf War of the early 90s, where we had Saddam Hussein sending Scud missiles onto Israel. And I find myself together with my Holocaust survivor grandmother in a sealed room wearing gas masks. Okay, so I was 14 or 15, and she was well into her 70s, and we're sitting in the same room wearing gas masks, thinking, not knowing what's going to come out of those missiles that just blew up, miles from our house. So that was, I would say the point in time where I understood that while the promise for peace is great, and optimism is great to have, we need to also look at the downside of things, how things can go bad. So ever since then, I think I've been the one, looking for the worst case scenarios of, but in an effort to prepare, not to be depressed, So I think that's really my, upbringing there. And then as far as education, I was always drawn to the sciences because my father, he's an eminent organic chemist. And he was always just talking about science, from the day I remember myself. It was him talking about high-level chemistry synthesis in the lab, as if anybody understands, just rambling on and on about it. And that was my upbringing. And then I happened to grow up, from the age of 10 in the Weizmann Institute of Science on campus. That's where we lived. And it was only natural for me to go about and do my PhD there. So I really, until I was in my 30s, early 30s, I never left campus. So the drive to do science, to change the world, what was in me, to do something that's left, after my body demises, something for the world, whatever I can do, in my small footprint. So that's that's really the background. And then I was drawn very much to the life sciences. I was fascinated by how much I don't know about the human body or about the animal kingdom. And so I was very much drawn into physiology, and that led me into vet school, actually in Israel. But doing a short stint in the very lucrative vet school in Rehovot, I realized that really what I'm drawn to is understanding deeper and deeper and deeper. And going deeper into my vet school studies, it became more of a practice kind of routine rather than, exploration of Mother Nature. So I crossed the street back into the Weizmann Institute for my master's and then my PhD, but I was still looking for something that's very applicable to the, medicine arena. So most scientists there are just purely basic science. So I found Professor Yair Reisner, who focused on transplantation of bone marrow
Yep.
in a mismatched setting. And I was fascinated by his efforts to try and overcome graft rejection.
Sure.
Something that sounded so cool. How the hell does that even work? So I kind of was fascinated by trying to understand better and if there's any way to overcome graft rejection and just the idea of bone marrow, transplanting bone marrow sounded like science fiction. And it still does, to be honest. It's the most, I think, fascinating medical procedure out there. Um, so yeah, so that was really my crave, and I went in deeper and deeper, and I stumbled upon radiation injury in mice as a mechanism, basically to do research. We used that animal model and
Right.
irradiating mice, and then I observed the tremendous potential of bone marrow transplantation, the miracle of taking a very small amount from one identical sibling into the other, as little as 2% of the bone marrow. And that was enough to resuscitate the whole blood forming system in the recipient that had been lethally irradiated. And then you see the counterparts of that individual that had been transplanted, that they all die a horrible death within 2 weeks. So the power of just, moving such a small fraction of one's in the body into the other, a very minute fraction of, less than 1 milliliter in the mice. You can see such a tremendous, recovery. You're basically transferring life by the syringe.
Yeah, it's no, I appreciate you sharing all that story, and clearly that you see the pieces to ultimately what we're going to be getting into taking form
Mhm.
in the very early days. And I do appreciate you taking us back to the story with your grandmother as well. Let's talk about a couple of these topics before we get into StemRad, just to get the audience up to speed on some of where we're going. But let's talk about ionizing radiation a bit, because we've touched on it a bit on previous shows, primarily from the perspective of radionucleotide-based pharmaceuticals and
Mhm.
interesting antibody radionucleotide conjugates and things like that. And we've talked about both alpha and beta particles. Now, these cause damage, but they don't technically get very far into us from the outside. Obviously, if somebody decides to poison us, God forbid, but that's a whole other story. But the issue really today that we're going to be getting into is gamma radiation, which does get through us. And not only damages tissues, but causes a lot of problems for our DNA. Um, Give us a little primer, if you would, on gamma radiation, and a little bit of, barring all the technologies we're going to be getting into, what the damage really looks like from I guess, a typical accident, whether I'm hanging out at Chernobyl or Fukushima or God forbid, whatever the case may be, terrorist event. What typically will you describe as sort of the gamma radiation event in a human?
Well, Ira, that's a very good question. And the truth of the matter is that we don't know too much, not enough, let's put it that way, about what happens when people are exposed to gamma radiation. This has happened hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times, but not enough to know at a deterministic level of what happens when such a dose is received by an individual. Because look at the human lethality curve, and you can easily see that there's a huge breadth of probabilities. So there's one individual that can die from as little as 100 rem, and then there's another individual that would take 600 rem to die from. So it's really gonna depend on your genetic makeup, on also the source of gamma radiation. Are we talking about a high energy source, a low energy source? Are we talking about something that's over the duration of 10 minutes or 100 minutes? So we have, we like to say this dose will kill you, but there's actually, a spectrum of possibilities. And we've seen that in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki. and in Chernobyl, where we had people surviving 600 and 700 and others dying at 150. So why is it that way? Nobody knows most definitely. But what we do know is that bone marrow damage is always the most prevalent symptom that is observed most frequently in individuals that are exposed to gamma radiation. We can see that at doses above 100 rem, we always see anemia in the individual. So you always see a drop in blood counts. That's not something that differs across the board. Now, the point of lethality will differ greatly, but seeing that anemia, blood counts dropping, specifically white blood cells, and then platelets, and then erythrocytes, that happens over the course of a few weeks. Even if the person survives, the difference between the survivor and the non-survivor is that the survivor, his blood counts bounce back. So we see a drop and then a bouncing back. Whereas an individual that ultimately succumbs, there's no bouncing back.
Got it.
So at StemRad, we're basically trying to guarantee that your bone marrow will bounce back because you're going to have enough of it surviving during the radiation exposure.
Got it. And one more thing, just want to touch on before we get into what StemRad's up to. Again, Chernobyl happened back in '86, Fukushima 2011. And in one of your papers, I was taking a look at, this was Health Physiology 2017 September, selective shielding of bone marrow. You give a sort of an introduction that, hey, at Chernobyl, and we'll see this in the HBO special, we made these sort of makeshift lead sheeting things they wore. You mentioned the Fukushima, they really didn't have anything available. What's sort of been the history? I mean, we always hear about lead. Are there other things that have been used, going back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the research that followed that, between there and where we're going with StemRad, what's sort of been the history for protecting the human body? I mean, obviously you put that little, gown on when I get X-ray at the doctor's office, but what's sort of been the state of the art?
That's another great question with a kind of depressing answer, because there hasn't been too much. Okay, so what we have today, the X-ray apron or the lead gown, whatever you want to call it, that's been around ever since Röntgen pretty much discovered radiation. So not much has changed there. Now, the problem with these aprons is that they're great for low energy gammas, which are very similar to X-rays, okay, like 100 kV, 200 kV, but they do nothing to stop the highly penetrating gammas of higher energy. So wearing that will make you feel good. It won't do anything for your health. And we see Chernobyl first responders back in the day, they tried to wear these, and then they realized it wasn't helping with their dosimeters. So they amassed more and more lead around their bodies, but in a very uniform way. So even though they were wearing up to 26 kilograms each, that was dispersed uniformly across their body. So doing that, once again, the gamma just enters easily because you're ending up with a layer of like 1 millimeter of lead, let's say, or 2 millimeters of lead. To block gammas in a PWR, like a nuclear incident, then you would have to have layers of lead in excess of 0.5 centimeter, okay? To have a meaningful blunting of that radiation, and to try and protect the whole body with such a layer, it's going to weigh hundreds of kilograms for the individual. So the world, over the course of the past 70 years, post World War II, they've been trying to come up with a material that is more lightweight than lead in an effort to cover the whole body. Unfortunately, lead is still the most lightweight material when it comes to blocking gamma radiation. So pound for pound, you need the least amount of mass when it comes to lead compared to other materials. So steel, you would need almost 2 times the mass to block the same amount of radiation. So it really varies across the elements, and lead is unique in that sense. So it's a great material to use. So it's been the only holy grail of radiation protection, but it's insufficiently good if you want to protect the whole body. So understanding that there's no way to protect the whole body because it's too heavy, the world gave up on actual gamma radiation protection.
Got it.
Now, you mentioned research done right after the war. So that was very interesting because what they did was they took rats and rabbits and eventually dogs and then non-human primates years later, and they irradiated them in a scenario that's very similar to Hiroshima or Nagasaki, striving for doses that we know that had been received by those individuals in Japan. And they found that, the animals would die horrible deaths with the caveat that if an area in the body rich in red bone marrow was rescued from that irradiation, then the animals would die less or not die at all. And this was almost accidentally observed. So specifically with mice or rats, simply the tail of the rat was outside of the radiation beam, not by intention, but by chance. And there was enough bone marrow, turns out, in the tail for the rat to not die from radiation. So whatever was not irradiated in the tail, in those vertebrae in the tail, was able to regrow and replenish the system. So that's how scientists discovered the power of bone marrow. So nobody knew what that material was. It was something within the marrow of the bone without any understanding. So it's the first time that people understood what bone marrow is at all was then. And it took them many years to identify that what was coming out of that tail. Was it some kind of substance that was secreted from the tail to save the life of the rat? Or was it something cellular? Was it at the cell level? So it wasn't, they thought it was some kind of a chemokine that was secreted and saving the body of the individual. Because it was so hard to believe there was a cell, because we never saw cells migrate to the extent that would make any difference. And but over the years in the 60s, they saw that it was cells that were migrating from those spared vertebrae, into the blood system, into the circulatory system. And through that system, they were basically homing to other stricken areas in the body and repopulating them, just like pilgrims, to the point where those cells expand within the spleen and within other stricken areas to regenerate all the blood-forming function of that bone that was hollow until that pilgrim arrived. So that was fascinating, and it came out in a Nature paper in I think 1963, where they identified and they called it a stem cell. So that's the first stem cell to be discovered. And this is all due to post-Hiroshima and Nagasaki research.
Fascinating. Really fascinating. So then that leads one other place, and then we'll get to StemRad. But let's talk about the pelvis. Because again, you're learning from this 2017 paper. So got my pelvis right here. It contains my colon, my bladder, my kidneys, and my wife, her ovaries, my male parts, and 50%. I was unaware of 50% of my body's active bone marrow in that region. Say a couple words about this, because as you mentioned before, we have to be strategic about what we're covering up and protecting. Talk a little bit about the human pelvis and obviously why then StemRad is focusing where it's focusing initially.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. So the human pelvis is home to 50% of the body's bone marrow. And so it's no circumstance that that's the area from which bone marrow is harvested when you're transplanting a bone marrow. So when you have a leukemia patient that receives radiotherapy, basically lethal doses of radiation, just like in Chernobyl, in an effort to eradicate his or her leukemia cells, as a side effect only, the bone marrow is wiped out, this being the most susceptible tissue. Now, the good Samaritan comes along, the donor, and he lies on the bed. And usually in the process of inserting syringes, big syringes, into his posterior pelvis, the bones in your back around your waist area. So that's where you have 50% of your body's bone marrow, and it's the most validated area. And so across hundreds of thousands of people, syringes were entered and have found bone marrow in that area and harvested and transplanted. Now it's there in a disproportionate way, and that is the only thing that enables selective shielding. Okay, so all of a sudden you don't have to protect all of the body to protect a significant chunk of your bone marrow on the one hand. On the other hand, you need a second miracle. You need that chunk to regenerate and repopulate the stricken areas in the body. So it's able to do that. So it's a 1-2 punch of you have a tissue that's able to regenerate, which is very rare in the body, and that tissue happens to be concentrated in a very limited surface area of the body. And then a third miracle is that is the area in the body that's easiest to amass weight on. So if you're looking at putting 30 pounds of PPE on a certain area of the body, there'd be very few areas where that would be possible, except the hips. So this was the perfect storm for us. And actually, in the beginning, we thought that the femur would be the area to protect because that's the area in mice. They have a different pelvic structure. So the area in mice is the upper femur. And lucky for us, in humans, it's actually, through working with hematologists, we understood that it's actually the posterior ilium. That is where you want the highest amount of shielding there.
Well, that takes us now to 2011. You co-found StemRad, again, following Fukushima. Talk about the company. Talk about what the core, I mean, there's a couple different products in terms of StemRad MD, the AstroRad product, and then Gamma 360.
Right.
Take a little time to walk us through what you started off with, what you've been up to since 2011, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the studies that you've been performing with groups like the DO.
Right. So I was doing my postdoc in San Diego, the Scripps Research Institute with Nobel laureate lab, studying or rather researching innate immunity, toll-like receptors, and things of that nature. And the whole radiation injury thing was already, in the past. It was still living within me, but I wasn't focusing on that so much during my research there, even though I did identify a new mechanism for iron deficiency in mice, because that was my crave, so I continued somehow to do it with that lab. But really, what happened was another perfect storm, but a disaster, unfortunately. It was in the midst of my research, I was also teaching immunology, and I just came back from teaching immunology in Los Angeles, came back to my house in San Diego, and I just flipped open the laptop. It was around midnight, and I just saw this, and this is in San Diego, and I saw this news flowing in of a disaster in Japan. A nuclear disaster following that awful tsunami. So all of a sudden I was, it shook me to my foundation because I knew about Chernobyl all too well. My PhD advisor, he was one of the few that went to Chernobyl the day after to try and save those brave individuals. He was summoned by the USSR before there were formal relations between USSR and Israel. This is 1986. So they chartered a plane and they brought him to Moscow, to hospital number 6, where that's where they took the Chernobyl first responders to. And he, alongside other 2 advisors of StemRad, back in the day, they were not advisors, but they were eminent transplantation scientists and physicians. And they got there and they saw that while most bodily functions were okay in these individuals, the one tissue that was wiped out was the bone marrow. So they were required to perform transplantation, but in the absence of identical donors, they resorted to haploidentical, half identical from siblings. And that just prolonged their suffering, unfortunately, because they still had a lot of graft rejection and even graft versus host disease. So T cells and B cells within the graft were actually attacking the individual from the inside. So the specialty of my professor back in the during my PhD, Yair Reisner, his specialty was to remove those T cells, but he had shown it only in rabbits, and a very short time before this happened. And while in rabbits it was able to perform, in human in field conditions, he was able to remove the vast majority of T cells, but not enough. A very small amount is still enough to taint that bone marrow transplant and cause severe issues in the individual. To this day, whenever you need a bone marrow transplant, only identical donors are called upon. So you would take from an unidentical person only on the extreme circumstances. So it's a big deal. So I was already very much embedded into the Chernobyl incident, and the heritage was still beating within me. This is in 2011. But the thing about Chernobyl is that everybody spoke about it as a one-off incident, that while as horrible as it would never happen again, because now reactors are a lot safer, and in the westernized societies, we don't do things like in the USSR. So it's a different world, et cetera, et cetera. But then this happened in Japan, okay? And what I perceive to be one of the most developed nations in the world, with American-built reactors, with a seawall, with all the, measures that should have been taken were taken. Well, since then, the measures became stricter, but back in the day, they were state of the art, world class, and even they are having a cascading nuclear meltdown event over the course of days without an ability to send in their first responders due to radiation. Okay, so the Chernobyl folks, they went in spite of the radiation. In Japan, they were a lot more cautious. Given the precedent of Chernobyl, they went in carefully, but being careful means time is allowed to elapse. And time is your worst enemy when it comes to a meltdown. And to this day, a huge territory in Japan is still uninhabited. The total cost of that incident surpassed $1 trillion. Japan has been pumping out greenhouse gases for no reason since then. They shut down all the reactors. So that one incident, so even if it's so rare, to have the ability to respond to that once in a lifetime event will save your country from almost demise. So Japan is so strong it was able to survive that, but many countries wouldn't be able to survive that even. So the economic burden of that is tremendous. So whenever I'm asked about, okay, but it's a small market, this is for a doomsday incident, I say, exactly, because when you account for the money generated by that incident or lost by that incident, $1 trillion, there are very few products in the world that address a $1 trillion market. So here we have such a product today. This product would enable those Fukushima firefighters to enter boldly and quickly and without having to pay with their lives to perform the most important mission in the world at that time. And that was to provide necessary cooling to those reactors from the inside and prevent that cascading reactor nightmare of an event. So I knew I had to act. I had to stand up, leave academia, and start the company with a full level of commitment in an effort to create the first gamma radiation PPE.
And Oren, we talked on previous episodes about the FDA's animal rule in the United States in terms where there's things like nuclear events where just human studies are not feasible or ethical to do. In the case of your domain, sort of radiological sciences, there have been these computational phantom studies that have been around for a little bit. Could you
Mhm.
explain what that's all about? Because I know that's what you've been involved in, sort of working with the United States Department of Energy.
Mhm.
What is a computational human phantom study, and how does it work? And a little bit of how you worked with the DOE on this particular part of the project.
Right. So whenever you test a radiation protection solution, then you want to be able to account for the amount of radiation that that individual received,
Yeah,
be it in real life or theoretically.
yeah.
And by account, I mean you want to know what amounts of radiation entered what area in the body. So the body, as we understand, is not uniformly sensitive to radiation. So if radiation to the brain has been received in a certain amount, that same amount into the bone marrow would cause a lot more damage
Yeah.
for the reason that the brain is a lot less susceptible to radiation. So even 5 times the amount of radiation that enters the bone marrow, should it enter the brain, you'd be fine. Okay. But in the case of bone marrow, it'd be wiped out. So the distribution of the dose deposition, we call it, within the human body is critical. Now, there are two ways to calculate that, to account for that. And one of them, as you mentioned, is computer driven through usually supercomputers using Monte Carlo simulations,
Mm-hmm.
statistical simulations, where you bombard this digital phantom with millions of photons or particles in the case of space radiation. And then you see the position that is really resulting from the body's natural attenuation properties. So the body is able to blunt a lot of the radiation itself. So where you have a denser tissues, then you're going to have more blunting of the radiation. A bone is much better at blunting the radiation than fat tissue, for example. So all these things are brought into account to give you the number of particles that landed in the bone marrow, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, you can assess the damage and the chances for death. So that's one way. The other way is to do an actual lab empirical measurement using rando phantoms. That's a state of the art, which is basically a human skeleton, a deceased individual that was embedded or embalmed, whatever you want to say, inside polymer that represents the attenuation factor of soft tissue. So this rando phantom, it's basically a skeleton encased in sort of polymer plastic, if you will. And so we did both. We did the simulations, and then we did the actual study at P&L in Washington State, and using a cesium-137 source that was basically presented in a sphere-like geometry onto a rando phantom, one of them wearing the product and the other remaining naked, and then doing comparative analysis of the radiation dose deposition into the body and certain, with hundreds of dosimeters into certain areas of the body. So we're able to account for attenuation of the radiation into the bone marrow, into the bladder, into the colon, all the gastric tissue there. And that was what we're able to do there. And it really corresponded well with the simulations. And then we did simulations again, and that corresponded well as well. So it's an evolution of studies that culminated in that publication that you mentioned in 2017, which encompasses both the actual measurements and the simulations. And we're very happy to find that, because many people were skeptical. That they said, the belt is nice, but you're going to get radiation entering from above and below. But thankfully, the body is able to attenuate the radiation coming from above and below to a sufficient extent, the body itself, without any aid. Where you really need the supplement of shielding is in the posterior area of the bone marrow along the back, the mid-back section, the lumbar vertebrae, and that whole area is where you really need a supplement of a significant amount of shielding to prevent entry into that area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the study no doubt got a lot of attention, and you've uh, you've been on fire since. I know most recently, a couple of months ago, you announced this big relationship with the United States National Guard, specifically focused on the 360, the gamma belts. Can you, obviously, without giving anything very confidential, you can just talk a little bit about, because we'll talk about space and sort of the civilian sector in a bit, but if you could just say, a couple words about, obviously you're moving from the research you've been doing for the last decade to real world opportunities now. Can you say a few words about the National Guard relationship?
Yeah, sure. So, having tested the product with the DOE and then fielded it in Israel,
Right.
in the two most sensitive reactor sites we have there. So there was precedent for use of the product. There was interest from the DoD. And then we built a relationship with the National Guard, where we realized that they are the first responders to nuclear incidents in the homeland. So should there be a Fukushima-like event, you'd have National Guardsmen addressing that and being alongside the local firefighters being first on the scene. And these are highly specialized units. They're called the WMD CSTs, so Weapons of Mass Destruction Civil Support Teams.
Yep.
And we have two of these teams in most states. Some states have only one team, but each team comprises about 50 individuals, and they have the best, the latest and greatest technology to address any WMD-like setting. Could also be an accidental reactor breach, but could also be an intentional reactor breach. It could also be a nuclear detonation. And they're training for all of these things. So while we saw they had excellent protection for chem, bio, alpha, and beta, they had nothing for gamma. So it went without saying that they were the lowest hanging fruit in the market for us. So we worked alongside them in defining their needs and also with Congress in making sure that they receive the funding necessary. We had the great support of local representatives here in the Tampa Bay region where we manufacture the product. And eventually we were added on to the appropriations list for funding. And long story short, we got funded about almost a year ago. And then we're able to manufacture and deliver by the end of last year, by the end of 2023. And now the products are in the process of being fielded with the forces across the country. And we're very busy running drills with them and training them right now.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it seems like there's a fountain of possibility there, and we've been covering all these agencies from DITRA to USANCA to everything in between, where some version of the CBRN
that's right, many of them
protection. Yeah, that's awesome. Or when we had Uri on, and we talked about the AstroRad component of this, so space and radiation protection vest, and so in this case a little slightly different product, but nonetheless, what happens up there is, obviously the great unknown, and it's a wash in gamma radiation and all sorts of other, from my comic book days, all sorts of other interesting wavelengths. Talk a little bit, sort of reintroduce AstroRad, if you would, because I know, you got ISA, NASA, you had Lockheed involved. Reintroduce that project, because that's another awesome one.
Yeah, that's really a great story, because we had already developed the 360 gamma bone marrow shield for first responders. We had limited fielding. It was a very long, drawn process with the US. So in the meantime, we had very little revenue, if at all. So we were in the business of looking for research grants, and we stumbled upon a solicitation by Space Florida, which is an entity of Enterprise Florida, of the governor here in the state of Florida, that they were calling to support collaborations between Florida and an Israeli company. Okay, a Florida company and an Israeli company in the field of space, without being too specific. Well, they mentioned satellites and electronics and stuff, but heat shields, but nothing about radiation. But still, I felt like it's worth a shot. So we met with them when they were visiting Tel Aviv, the Space Florida folks, and they were quick to offer us a meeting with Lockheed Martin that were there on the scene. They basically invited Lockheed Martin into our meeting. And of course, we were happy to have them. And it turned out to be the two most senior individuals in Lockheed Martin space that were there in the room with us. And Mr. John Karras was there. He was the one that captured the Orion program for Lockheed Martin back in the, I think 2013 or so, and maybe before that actually. And he was sitting there smiling, and I just gave my 10-minute spiel of we're gonna take our proven technology from the first responder military sector and adapt it for the needs of astronauts traveling within your spacecraft, the Orion spacecraft. And I told them how we're gonna do it. I told them about selective shielding. And there was 10 minutes of me speaking and then a minute of silence that was unclear because we were really offering something that has rarely been touched upon. Everybody's talking about electronic components, avionics, heat shields, composite materials, and then this thing that is very different, and also the need wasn't there until those days. This is in 2015, because only then did NASA declare its intent to send people into deep space for the first time since the Apollo missions. So it was very timely. So I said, and then he stood up, he offered his hand, and we shook hands, and he said, "Oren, you have a partner. You have a partner for doing this." And ever since then, we've been very close collaborators with Lockheed Martin. We captured 7 grant awards together over the course of now 9 years of working together. We had 2 magnificent payloads, one to ISS and one on Artemis around the moon.
Nice.
Artemis 2. So we're able to fly on Orion. Just like living up to the promise, which sounded almost like science fiction back in the day. And those grants that I mentioned were able to keep us alive long enough to get to this National Guard sale, basically, which was a multi-million-dollar sale, our first big sale. And in parallel, also, we developed a medical solution. So it gave us the oxygen necessary to develop, to continue to develop StemRad, to stay in the game with 360 gamma, and also develop a whole different solution, which is for cath labs for, basically the antiquated lead aprons are being kicked out of the ORs as we speak, looking at our solution, which is way better. And obviously, we had the support of investors along the way. Many long-term investors have been with us throughout the journey, and we couldn't have done it without them. So, yeah.
Excellent. So, so as we were chatting before the show, and as you know, I'm sitting here. I'm in Jersey right now, but I grew up in Philadelphia, and I remember 3 Mile Island. I'm a huge nuclear power fan. I'm extremely nervous about nuclear radiation leaks and nutty people like Kim Jong-un and Putin and Iranian mullahs and all the nuts that whatever. I see that I can go to the Rad Store 360 and pick up some of these units for myself nowadays. Not a bad price either. Talk a little bit about the civilian unit, if you would, and a little bit of what's involved there, and we're sort of the research requirements or the regulations regarding getting these things to civilians different than what you experienced, or is it all sort of the same basket of stuff you had to be involved in?
Right. So call me naive, but when I started StemRad, my target market was the civilian market, because I felt, you're going to have a detonation. The first few minutes or the first hour, 2 hours are really what count.
Right.
So people being downwind of the detonation are going to experience the plume. And whoever survived the blast, and you're going to have a lot of survivors, they're going to succumb to the gamma radiation within that plume. So I felt like, why not equip all the people with this product? And then, it became, investors and savvy business people said that would not be possible. You're talking about millions of people. It would never work. And also the geopolitical climate was not supportive of that. So nobody was afraid of a nuclear holocaust 10 years ago. But now things are changing fast. So realizing that I can actually go back to that original market that I really aspired towards. And now, given the war in Ukraine, given Iran, given Rocket Man in North Korea, I understand suddenly, unfortunately, but fortunately for our effort, the world is now more and more aware of the nuclear threats, and this is trickling down into individuals that are usually very intellectual people that are aware of the threats and understand that the likelihood is very small for them to ever use this product. Yet they say, this is my insurance policy. And they love that it has a very long shelf life of over 20 years. So they say, it's a one-off investment. I have 20 years of relative comfort, with regards to this threat, me and my family. So yeah, we've sold hundreds of these to risk-averse individuals, whatever you want to call them. But take Israel, for example. As much as I love that country, I think every person in Israel now should have this product. And unfortunately, because Iran may already have nuclear weapons, and if not, they have the capability to do it in an unstoppable fashion, according to all analysis. Unless Israel does a preemptive nuclear strike, there's no way to stop it. That's what IAEA is saying. That's what DOD is saying. So it's a matter of time before they have it. And if they have it, it's a matter of time before Hezbollah will have it. And because they have direct transfer of weaponry into Lebanon. Syria is in their pocket. There's no way. Israel is just, putting fingers in the wall that's about to burst with water, if to use that analogy. And so we have to shift to containment. So if we're not going to prevent it, then let's contain it.
Yep.
There will be the day after, even if they use a nuke on Israel. I think the very worst case scenario, thousands are going to die, maybe tens of thousands, no more, are going to die. And then there's going to be the day after. And that day after, Israel has to have the advantage. It does have the advantage on the offensive side. It needs an advantage on the defensive side.
Right.
And that defensive side, a lot of it will rely on how we protect our people, which are going to be a lot more protected than the people in Iran, for sure.
Yep. Sobering.
It is, but human nature, well, we're always surprised. Who would have thought Russia killing Ukrainians, close to 1 million people dying across the board, two very similar cultures, same religion.
Right.
What's going on in this world? So suddenly I feel like our product is pretty conservative. I mean, it's not something ludicrous to buy for your family anymore,
Right. Yep. Well, now it's good to know that there's an effective countermeasure that's on the market. So I mean, that's again, I'm glad you've developed the civilian application. I'm glad there's the opportunity to purchase it, and so no, it's an important piece of this story. Oren, I noticed a little bit a couple of weeks ago. It was the 2024 CBRN Defense Conference and Exhibition. You're on stage there with a lot of the folks we've had on the show, General Friedrichs at the White House Pandemic Office, Chris Grice there, formerly leading up JTRO at DITRA. Talk a little bit about what else is coming up for you in 2024 in terms of your schedule, maybe different conferences and meetings we can find you at that are coming up, potentially listen to you, meet you, anything else on the calendar that we should be knowing about while we have you today, please.
Right. So it's been a very busy season for us. We attended many conferences with exhibitions and giving talks. As far as the summer goes, there's very little activity in our domain. Okay, so it really it goes down quite a lot. With that said, there is the NGA US conference. So
Right.
it's the National Guard Association US conference in Detroit, where we're going to be there. I think it's in August, the end of August. We're going to be there with the big booth. It's going to be a great show with many of our end users on the scene there. We're also going to participate in multiple drills with the National Guard. I don't know how many of them are going to be open for the public or not. There's also a drill that SOCOM is running.
Sure.
So towards the end of the year, all with the emphasis on solutions for CBRN, countermeasures, protective gear, and so on and so forth. So we're happy to participate in those. But then we're also going to be very busy with our space vertical. We have at the end of this month, we have the ISS R&D conference in Boston, where we're going to be talking about 3D printing of personal radiation protection in space, in orbit.
Neat.
And we've done that with the vest. We printed huge chunks of the vest on the International Space Station using recycled polymers, polyethylene, basically, plastic waste. They have tons of that, literally tons on ISS, and also on Orion. They're going to have that. In any space architecture, they're going to have a lot of plastic waste, and plastic happens to be the best material when it comes to blocking space radiation.
Yeah.
So StemRad, enjoys the same selective shielding arrangement of the 360 gamma in the sense that it's thicker in proximity to the bone marrow, but it's also thicker in proximity to other tissues in the body because you can amass more weight in space with the luxury of microgravity. Therefore, you have a vest-like structure versus the belt, which is more minimalist. But the key with space radiation, it's ions, it's usually protons. So what you want to do is use hydrogen-rich materials to try and prevent the entry of those ions.
Got it.
So that way you get less secondary radiation generation. So that's our solution. We're able to use many of the parasitic mass that are present in these architectures towards recycling and printing of wearables. We did that with Redwire Space, that project over the course of 3 years, and now we're gonna publish those results and give a talk at the end of this month. And then in October we have the Great IAC Conference, which is the premier international space conference in the world, and that's going to take place in Milano this time. Milan at the end or 17th of October. We're giving a talk there. We're going to be presenting together with Uri Oron at the Israeli Space Agency booth and also with Lockheed Martin at the same time. So that's going to be a great experience. Other than that, I'm sure many shows that I forgot, but I do feel like we're busy on all fronts. With the medical product, we're busy mostly in installing systems in hospitals.
Got it.
It's less of an educational play with medical because they know they need protection. They're already wearing antiquated protection. But the problem with their protection is that it's heavy, it's on their shoulders, it's killing their backs, causing injury, and then also not protecting their head at all. Now, while the head is less susceptible than the bone marrow, it's still over the course of 30 years, they're irradiating the head on par with hundreds of CT scans of the head, so an equivalent dose. So we're seeing a lot of brain tumors in these doctors, mostly left-sided, facing the X-ray tube. So it's really horrible. And the only reason that they haven't been wearing head protection is because of the weight of any such a solution. But we developed a product, an exoskeleton, that's able to take the weight of the lead apron off of the body of the user while also adding on more protection. You can add anything you want to this exoskeleton. It's a platform for adding different gadgets as well, a flashlight, a fan, whatever you want to put on there. And then it's not on the wearer. The wearer is able to move around in it, function, operate. So that's a solution. So really very busy times for us. We're still a very small company. So we're a company with a relatively low burn rate, understanding that the educational play with the government and NASA is a very long duration one.
Sure.
So we need to conserve cash. The only cash hungry really endeavor is the medical one, and that's where we also got quite a lot of private investments towards
Cool.
that. Yeah.
Very cool. And for everybody watching and listening, you can check out the Dr. Milstein was talking about the product known as StemRad MD, and you can we'll put a link to the website, of course, but you can take a look at sort of the full exoskeleton system for that one. That's it's equally cool. But no, really great stuff, Warren. I'm excited for the company and the fact that you're executing on all these fronts. Not just obviously our first responding heroes, but for the entire civilian sector as well. And just really wishing you the best with it all, you and your team, as you continue to move things forward. But really a great story.
Thank you.
Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode across the various podcast networks or watching on our YouTube channel, again, you've been spending time with Dr. Oren Milstein, Chief Executive Officer and board member of StemRad, leading the path in personal radiation protection solutions for our heroes and civilians on Earth and beyond. Oren, I just really want to thank you for joining us today, for educating us. Thank you for everything you do in creating these products. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for creating a better and extremely safer tomorrow for all of us via what you do. Really great story.
I appreciate being on your show. It's a great show, and I really love the interview. And I'm happy to, come on again when I have big news.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Great having you.
Okay.